Hi, this is Ruth McCambridge, the editor-in-chief of Nonprofit Quarterly, and we're very happy to welcome you today, even you from Madrid, who just checked in with us. Very happy to welcome you today to our webinar with Hilda Polanco. Today we're going to be featuring a webinar. Hilda is from Financial Management Associates, better known as FMA, and she'll be talking with us about the uses and effect of capital in nonprofits, how to think differently about it. In my experience, this is actually an area of management where many boards and executives and your funders are less than clear, even while there is great clarity to be had. And I do remember the first time that I actually gained clarity about how capital worked in my organization, and it was in conversation with the great Clara Miller. But Hilda is no less excellent at presenting in a very simple way how you can understand what capital is, how it can be used, and how it should be reflected in your organization, and some of the unseen costs of certain kinds of capital. So she'll talk to you more about that in a minute. Over the years, NPQ has run any number of articles on the topic, and we will send those to you later. They will be made available to you. But here, Hilda's going to walk you through the basic conceptual frameworks with some examples, and then we'll leave time for questions. The one question we really don't want you to send us is the question, will we get a copy of this after the webinar? You will. And so don't worry, we're going to send you everything after the webinar, and it'll be available on our site as well, so you don't need to ask us that question. This webinar is free to you because it's sponsored by MetLife. And MetLife is one of the largest life insurance companies in the world. It was founded in 1868 and is a global provider of life insurance, annuities, employee benefits, and asset management. For 20 years, MetLife has been reinsuring charitable gift annuity programs, and today reinsures CDA programs for about 34 charitable organizations in 20 states. So we want to thank MetLife a great deal for allowing us to present this to you all free today. Just a couple of logistics before we go on to the presentation. The first is that we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. And so at any point when you're feeling like you have a question that hasn't been answered in Hilda's presentation, just go ahead and log it into the question panel that you'll find at the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll keep track of them, and at the end I'll ask the ones that I know haven't been covered yet. And then finally, you'll see a hashtag Hilda on Finance at the bottom right-hand side of your screen also. And if you could use that to, as you tweet about what's going on here, it'll help people, it'll help spread not so much the knowledge inside of this webinar, although a little bit of that, but it'll help people to know that the resources are here that they need on capital. So please use that freely and you know, be a spreader of good information. And with that, I want to welcome Hilda Polanco. Are you there, Hilda?
Yes, I am, Ruth.
And just say thank you so much for doing this for us. It's one of a number that Hilda has done, and at the point we're really building a little series of the basics of nonprofit management here at NPQ. And for those of you that are interested, you should go and look at some of the other webinars, and Hilda's been a wonderful presenter on a number of them. So with that, Hilda, take it away.
Thank you, Ruth, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's topic of capital in the nonprofit sector. We often hear the term capital, and any number of ideas come up as to what it really means. And so this afternoon, I hope to spend some time with you allowing you to expand your thinking about what capital represents and how it supports an organization. When we think about capital, we think of it as the type of financial resource that supports an organization for the longer term. It builds capacity in many different ways as compared to revenue that an organization may generate or raise contributions towards to operate for a given year. So for this afternoon, I encourage you to broaden your framework of thinking about resource generation and work with me to think about what capital might look like in your organization or in the organizations that you're working with or on the boards of. The term capital campaign is a term that has evolved over time. I think in its initial conception, it was capital for buildings. Either new buildings we were purchasing or renovation or extensions of existing buildings. Capital is a very different term these days. It surely includes buildings, but it includes many more resource components that organizations need, not only to exist, but to be sustainable and successful over the long term. And so there's this intersection between revenue and capital that I think causes the greatest confusion. And as Ruth said, we'll be covering several examples of the different ways that an organization can raise capital and what it means in its financial statements and in its management processes. The intersection is especially interesting when organizations raise grants for the purpose of capital investment. So it is revenue to the organization, but very much for the long term. And so that's an area that we'll focus on, as well as capital in the more traditional way. In terms of what is capital, it has its sources. We bring capital to the organization in several different ways, which I'll explore. But the major distinction that we wanted to make is that capital accumulation can happen in one of two ways. It can come from internal resources, strategically growing reserves and available dollars for investments and risk taking. And when I say internal, it may be originally funds that were raised by the organization, but internally, leadership and board have identified certain dollars for the future. And that is a significant component of how capital is accumulated in the sector. In addition to internal decisions that boards and management can make about saving dollars for future investment, there are many types of external sources that a nonprofit can look to generate the capital that they need for in many different ways. Together, a combination of internal and external resources are available for uses of the organization. And an organization can require capital for that more traditional example of the building or the expansion of the existing structures. But more and more what we're seeing is capital being used in a different way. Capital, these resources for investment purposes, being used to grow an organization or to strengthen an organization's operations as the business model is refined. So think of capital as oxygen for the organization to be healthy and resilient as it faces the challenges and opportunities that it might. In terms of the various sources, as I mentioned, some internal and some external, I want to walk you through a few. And I want to begin by example of the accumulated surplus. An accumulated surplus for an organization is an internal resource that's been accumulated over time. And it really represents the profit, that excess that the organization has accumulated over time. We do live in a world where there's some debate, hopefully a decreasing debate, that a nonprofit should not earn a profit. And actually we believe that for an organization to be sustainable, profit, which means excess of revenues over expenses, often also referred to as a surplus, is absolutely critical for the long-term sustainability. So when organizations have a focused strategy to accumulate a certain level of surplus so that that accumulation can be available for the right decisions at the right time, that is a source of capital. And in many of our previous webinars and materials that you may have been exposed to through FMA, we've introduced you to this concept of LUNA, liquid unrestricted net assets. In our resources in the back, you'll see, if you haven't had a chance to read about LUNA, LUNA is a perfect example of what is the accumulated liquid available resource that an organization has. That is capital. LUNA is part of the capital structure for an organization. Also, a somewhat cross between internal and external is this idea that organizations at times can leverage either free or low-cost resources that are available to grow the organization, whether it's donations of time or space. Those are often overlooked when we think about where is our capital coming from. And again, those volunteers may be external to the organization, but the strategy of actually seeking those out is an internal strategy. And at times, the volunteering might even be from your own staff. So we've got accumulated resources, we've got in-kind. Those are our internal examples that we had in mind. And then there's another example that really creates capital for an organization. This is another external example, and that is debt. And debt is a form of capital. It is a leveraged vehicle. You might have a line of credit, you might have a mortgage, or more recently, and in a growing way, you might be interested in exploring a program-related investment, also known as PRI. PRIs come in different ways, but in most cases, a PRI is a loan, but it's a long-term vehicle, and the third party, primarily foundations, are looking at this as a type of investment, just like they would a grant, but the vehicle is in the case of a recoverable grant, meaning you will need to return those dollars at some point. And there's a return on investment that the organization, the foundation, is looking for, which becomes for you a cost of capital. The line of credit as a source of capital also has a lot of emotion attached to it. There are many board members who question the use of a line of credit in the nonprofit sector. I often refer to those as scars of war. They've been on nonprofit boards where the line of credit wasn't managed as strategically and appropriately as it should have been, and there's concern. We believe that a line of credit is an absolute business tool, and any organization that needs to weather storms of timing in terms of cash should look at a line of credit as an option. And so we have lines of credit, again, mortgages on buildings, debt as our third type of capital for an organization. And for today's discussion, the fourth and last type of capital that we're going to explore a bit more is this idea of an outside investment. And that is, of course, external. And the outside investment normally would come from a foundation or sometimes a major donor. And those outside investments are earmarked for things like I mentioned earlier, either physical capital, change capital, meaning things are going to be done differently in the future. Maybe it's for specifically creating a reserve. These are external parties who believe in your mission, believe in your business model, believe in your long-term plan, and are willing to make these long-term investments. And I want to emphasize that, because oftentimes organizations say, I would love to grow my multi-year unrestricted fundraising. That would be our ideal. Well, that could be a strategy, especially if there's a growth plan in that multi-year plan. But if we don't know what that is, if we don't have a multi-year financial model for what our vision of the future is, it makes it pretty hard to raise these funds. And if we're going to be thinking about what are the investments we need to make to bring the organization to where it needs to be, that multi-year vision is absolutely critical when we go to the marketplace to raise capital for that purpose. So just to stay on that idea of the financial capital that we can raise There's a couple of types, and there's a couple of purposes. So change capital, and you may hear things like change capital, risk capital, growth capital, often interchangeably. We think of change capital in three ways. An organization may have a growth and expansion plan, and that growth and expansion is going to require some investment. The organization might also be thinking about innovation, and this specifically I've seen certain foundations referred to as risk capital. Whether you're in the arts and you need to create art before it's ready for consumption, before your patrons will pay for it, or whether you're in mental health, and there is some research that you need to do or some testing of your program before you can actually go out and raise money with the expected outcomes. These are things organizations need to do in the area of research and development. And then lastly, in this category of change, is this idea of replenishment. If an organization has had some rocky operations in the past and has accumulated some deficits or just a very, very weak business model, it may need to replenish some of those resources that came in historically. The growth and expansion and the innovation are really areas for investment in infrastructure, facilities, people, technology. We have a vision. We want to be in a different place. Capital for those items are what we mean by investment in infrastructure. It also is towards a time when the revenue model will catch up. So it's for a period of time where we need some extra infusion of cash to be able to build these new capacities that we don't have right now. And so in both of those cases, dollars are coming in for a period of time with a specific goal in terms of what will be new and added to the operations, whether it's innovation, testing, or expansion of capacity. With respect to the last example I gave you, the replenishment, these are situations where an organization has had an accumulated deficit. Sometimes it's very clear. This manifests itself by you looking at the balance sheet, the statement of financial position for an organization, and seeing that the organization is in a negative unrestricted net asset. That is an indication that the organization is in a replenishment need. Oftentimes, it's not as clearly noted. If you have a building that you've invested in, your unrestricted net assets may look very strong because they include that building. But in our definition of LUNA, the liquid unrestricted net assets, we look at unrestricted net asset balances without the building. And when you do that, you might find yourself in what we call negative LUNA, which means the organization has had these deficits, and oftentimes it's not that clear. It's not that transparent. But for leaders of organizations that find themselves in that situation, it's really hard to raise operating revenue to recover these accumulated deficits. So oftentimes, this is part of a campaign to rebalance the organization's infrastructure, to replenish those resources that were invested in the past and set the organization on a path to success. We've worked with examples where grants have been made by foundations to do not only the replenishment, because that only gets us to zero, to a safety net, but we want to look at the future. So there are ways to not only replenish through capital, but also combine with growth and expansion. And those are part of what we could call a capital campaign, a campaign for sustainability, the fund for the future, lots of different ways to describe what we now are describing here as this change capital. I've seen it referred to as capacity capital as well. Another way that financial capital can be used is as a form of working capital, having reserves that will allow us to have liquidity. And liquidity allows us to pay our bills on time and not have to worry about vendors being unhappy or us being delayed in payroll or any other critical investment. So liquidity is extremely critical. And even when we're not in a change capital infrastructure situation, like my first example, Organizations need liquidity, and they need the sense of security that they can meet their operating obligations without a sense of crisis. And we think of these working capital examples as a cash bridge. It's either revenue shortage from a timing, this is timing, so it's more of a cash flow shortage, or expenses that you weren't expecting and are now in front of us. If it's a working capital concept, we are going to replace that cash. This is an interim internal loan. Or if it's an unforeseeable expense that's here to stay and we will not recover, then that's why we need those operating reserves that we talked about earlier. So another way for the capital structure of the organization to support it. And then the last example is this concept of endowments. And it is part of the capital structure of an organization. Endowments are a base to generate revenue in perpetuity. So the base of the endowment, the principal is never touched. And the funding that is available comes from the residual income that the organization has. And you might say, well, there's something missing, Hilda. How about all the temporarily restricted net assets that we raise for programmatic purposes? That's part of our capital structure. We sometimes have grants received well in advance. And while that may be the case, where you may have dollars in the bank that you've received from foundations or individuals for future activity, and it may at times be a helping hand with cash flow, we don't consider that part of available capital for the risks that we're talking about here. We're focusing on the unrestricted portions of your balance sheet that you can take for risks and expansion and liquidity and all of these other goals. So with endowments, and that's certainly the topic of a different webinar, but we encourage organizations, if you're thinking about building an endowment, that you and the board, leadership and the board, really think about, do we have the capacity, fundraising capacity, development capacity in terms of relationships, to raise sufficient endowment dollars that they will actually have an impact in terms of the revenue that they generate. A $100,000 endowment in the days that we're in right now, and probably will be for some time in terms of interest rates, doesn't really contribute much to operations, but yet it's locked in perpetuity for you. So grants for reserves, grants for change capital, much more accessible for organizations. And in terms of this, again, concept of fundraising campaigns for capital, I want to again emphasize that the capital campaigns are not just for construction or for building acquisitions. If you are thinking about a capital campaign or have been involved in one, it is not just for bricks and mortar and maybe the soft costs associated with our architectural designs. Capital campaigns that involve buildings also need to include these two elements. One element is on the ramp-up side. These buildings that are now up and running are not necessarily going to be fully utilized immediately. You may be doubling your capacity to deliver program. Well, that may need some funding to get to the point where you can actually generate the actual use of the building as it needs to in order to fully cover its costs. Another component of a capital campaign that is critical, and again, if you're thinking about such a campaign, you need to think about including, is some type of reserve to cover operations in the future. The more that you can raise towards this reserve, the more peace of mind you will have when the building is ultimately up and running. In some of my webinars, you've heard me talk about this concept called depreciation, which is the replacement estimate of what it will take to replace the assets you have. Depreciation is hard to factor into budgets for some organizations, and so the more that you have set aside in advance for future replacements over and above normal repairs, the more it will be possible for you to balance those needs, even if those organizations, those operating years don't generate enough for you to put funds aside for the replacement. So you want to start the campaign including those and end the campaign with as many dollars in these other categories as possible, and it's part of the request. It's part of the capital campaign. So when we think about all these sources of capital, we wonder, well, how does it show up in my financials? Some is debt, some are grants, some are reserves. Like where can we find all this? And on the balance sheet, which is the statement of financial position, unrestricted net assets can be in one of two ways, either undesignated or board designated. Those are where your risk capital is in that particular area. If you do have temporarily restricted net assets, those are released as the funds are spent down, as you've met your milestones. Think of them as capital, not because they're in the bank, as I mentioned earlier, but think of them as sources for meeting future activities. And these particular capital campaigns that I've been speaking about often reside in temporarily restricted net assets because they are for activities in the future with very specific goals and milestones. So many of the capital campaigns we see are in temporarily restricted for a period of time until the goals are met and the deliverables have been achieved. And if you are raising money for an endowment, that will be in your permanently restricted net assets. So the balance sheet net asset section is the most important component of assessing financial health when you're looking at an organization's financials. I encourage each and every one of you that is with us today, if you're a leader of an organization or you're on a board or you're a consultant that works with nonprofits, understanding the net asset composition in these three categories and the goals for each is one of the most critical initial parts of having a long-term plan for an organization. On the income statement side, some refer to it as the P&L. It's kind of a for-profit term. In the nonprofit sector, it's the statement of activities. There are a couple ways to show capital, and it is not short of confusion. The idea that revenue, which is what this appears as on the statement of activities, revenue for operations, but it's not operations, it's for capital. I have a few examples to share with you. There is some confusion, and actually for those of you who have been following the changes in the nonprofit accounting standards with the Financial Accounting Standards Board, they finally came out with changes in the presentation of nonprofit financials. But it wasn't everything they attempted to address. And the one area that has been postponed and the FASB is going to continue to address over the next few years is this idea of the definition of operations. And they were attempting to address these questions of capital that is non-operating resources and how to present those. And they gave up. They gave up because there was so much difference of opinion between the accounting field, the leadership, the funding community. And so that's to be continued. So given that the FASB hasn't figured it out, we're okay feeling the confusion. And what we're trying to do is help organizations at least think of it in a pretty consistent way and be able to explain it. I think with capital campaigns, both the hard physical capital as well as all of these other growth capital campaigns I've been referring to, it's really important that you, as the teller of your financial story, can explain the purpose of the capital and how it's been utilized and where you are to date. These campaigns tend to happen over time. And so in one particular example, or one way to think about it, the actual dollars that come in for capital are grouped with operating because it's really hard to separate. Oftentimes we're building the operations in an intricate way with the ongoing activity, so it's not so simple to differentiate. You'll see what that looks like in an example. Or in other examples where it is relatively possible to separate the expenditures that are related to the growth trajectory or the milestones in the campaign, that you might show capital grants and expenditures in a separate column. So that from an operating standpoint, remember the FASB's goal ultimately will be that nonprofits will be able to show operating results from non-operating results. This idea of a separate column, it might very well be where they end up. In the meantime, Organizations are doing the best they can to articulate their story, working with their outside accountants if they are audited and are presenting those financials. But the important part here is that we present it to our senior leadership, to our board, and to those funders who have invested in this, with their capital contributions to our infrastructure, that we're able to tell that story in a clear and concise way. So let me give you a few examples in terms of how you would think about this capital and how you would report it. One way that organizations, and we've seen all three, and the key here is having someone who is able to explain what it is and where it is. One way is the change capital is reflected entirely in the unrestricted net assets section. And so you can see that in this case, part of unrestricted net assets has some change capital that has been received in advance with no specific deliverables, just in support of the plan, and that has been grouped in unrestricted. We have a second example where the change capital, the board is so concerned about managing that growth fund in a really responsible way and keeping their eye on what the number is over time. Some boards will actually set up a separate fund for the capital campaign, especially if it's a longer term campaign where funds are being raised initially and then spent over time. The board designated fund is broken out separately and labeled board designated growth fund. That's just one example. And it's very clear to outsiders and board members, this is how much we've raised and still have available in unrestricted resources, meaning there is no specific deliverable, but it is in our mind earmarked for growth. If there was restricted capital, meaning we're going to build an evaluation system or we're going to build a technology system, and that's the only activity the funder is interested in funding, those might be not only, those would be in the temporarily restricted example. Some in unrestricted if it's just for the general plan, some in restricted if it's for specific purposes. And then the last example here is this idea that it would be in temporarily restricted, as I just mentioned, where the change capital is sitting in temporarily restricted until such time as it's utilized. All three examples are completely appropriate. We need to be able to articulate to outsiders and insiders, our board as well, where this capital is. And I can tell you it's not always clear as an outsider. The organization needs to tell its capital story. In terms of the statement of activities and how an organization budgets for this, there's a couple of ways. And here it's, again, confusing in that in this particular example, the grants for growth capital are lumped in with all other foundation giving. So $1.4 million represents everything, including the restriction, the growth plan capital that we've raised. The expenses are also combined. In these examples, organizations feel that it's very difficult to separate those two. And in their mind, the growth is part of who they are. It's an overall strategy, not one that can really be divided. So in the unrestricted column of the statement of activities and also in the budget, they would lump everything together into one. If you have that, it is very important that if there were milestones associated with the plan, that you keep an eye on those. And I have an example to share of what might look like if we were tracking milestones against these growth plans. So in one example, no differentiation. It's shown in one audit for the statement of activities. It's shown as one in the budget. The other example, and organizations who are really trying to keep an eye on the growth capital as it's being used prefer this example, and that's where they're shown below the line. And below the line says we're going to show all of our revenues for operations. We're going to show all our expenses, so all the grants for operations are up here. All of the expenses that are not growth related. So these are expenses that cannot be really isolated. We put them in with the regular expenses because we can't isolate them. So we're in essence building a deficit in that we have operating revenues that we're accounting for, and then we have expenses that can't be isolated. Maybe it's recruiting in a different way, maybe it's expanding the way that we develop our talent, and human resources are used for all purposes. In this case, the foundation grant growth capital is below the line, and in the below the line tracking, the board and management are very clear as to how much of the growth capital have we used and can clearly see how much do we have left. This could very well be an organization that either has it as a board designated fund on the balance sheet, or it's in temporarily restricted if it came with specific deliverables. So that's a different way to show it, and I've seen both ways utilized. And then in the case of capital for buildings, we were raising dollars, and actually before we get to the buildings, for the capital grants that are able to be separated, we know that the $400,000 was for personnel, for consultants, for technology. We know specifically what those activities were. A more transparent presentation would be to show it this way, where the use of that capital is tracked in a separate column, and within unrestricted, this is all the resources that the organization has, either through satisfaction of restricted grants or just general operations. We are showing it as a sub-column of the unrestricted category. That is another way to show it, and if possible, if the expenses can be shown that way, this is even more transparent than the second, which was more transparent than the first in terms of use of capital. And now for my last example with the idea of the capital for buildings. Many organizations we work with have operating budgets, but they don't necessarily have capital budgets. And capital in that context is more associated with the physical property, and they may have depreciation that they're using to fund the capital over time, but the budget itself may not often exist. We encourage you to have a capital budget, especially if it's a new campaign, and that capital budget would look something like this. The sources of the capital would be foundation grants. In this case, there's a mortgage on the new building, and the organization is investing its own reserves in balancing what is needed for the building to be in a healthy position. So the total $1.1 million is being used for these types of expenses: the building design, the construction, the ramp-up costs that I mentioned earlier, and the creation of a maintenance reserve. So the capital budget for the capital campaign would look something like this, and on an ongoing basis, the organization would continue to follow the concepts of capital budgeting with replacements and new acquisitions in the future. So this was my fourth example of management reporting. This is an example where the capital is for hard assets, and the previous examples were more for growth strategies and innovation and replenishment, those examples that I mentioned earlier. This document that I have here is, I would say, one of the most critical points of this conversation. It's not a budget that you would see as the overall organization's budget. It is not a statement of activities. It is a budget document whose goal is to monitor against a growth plan. When you first do a growth plan, typically 3 years, some are longer, you develop an original budget and you give it your best guess as to what it will cost to achieve the goals that you have. In year one, we're seeing here we're going to have a creation of key leadership positions. This was an example of an organization that was building a C-suite as it evolved to be able to be at a level of performance that it wasn't currently. They needed to build an evaluation system heavily in the first year. Never had done anything like that before. And it also needed to build the technology platform. In its growth plan, these were the 3 key deliverables. And they were over a 3-year period for a $1.2 million growth capital campaign. These 3-year budgets, with obviously lots of detail and assumptions, went out to different funders explaining what the plan was and what it would cost. And I can't stress enough, in growth plan development, assumptions and documentation of those assumptions are absolutely critical. Organizations are giving it their best shot, but they've certainly never done this before. And the funders don't necessarily know exactly whether the number is right or wrong, because it's unique to this organization and where it is and where it wants to be. So the assumptions behind the growth plan are absolutely critical as benchmarks for the future, so that after the first year or 6 months, however often you need to monitor it, you can ask yourself, so how are we doing? At the end of the first year, how are we doing with the creation of the key leadership positions? Well, we've only spent $50,000. We're behind. We haven't been able to find the chief development officer that we were looking for. The evaluation system, we're right on track. We're spending, and we have an accounting system that tells us that. We're able to track that these costs for these vendors are for the evaluation system. And then lastly, the technology platform actually cost us $100,000 in year 1. Is it an overrun? Are we spending more than we thought? Or is it a timing issue? Are we accomplishing this deliverable sooner than we thought? Those are absolutely the most critical questions for an organization to monitor internally, how they're doing against their plan. But more importantly, or I would say equally as importantly, to be able to speak to their funders of the growth plan and say, here's where we are. Yes, we thought we were going to be able to do this for $1.2 million. Here's what we've learned from year 1. We've refined our thinking. And let me tell you what that means for year 2 and 3. That's the third part of this analysis. So at the end of year 1, we want to go back and say, if out of the first year of the 3-year growth plan, we've had these results, what does that mean for 2 and 3? In the case of the leadership positions, we're going to move the hiring to year 2 and year 3, and we're still going to be able to do it with the $600,000 we expected. As far as the evaluation, we're on track, exactly the way we thought. With the leadership positions, there's going to be more that's going to be in year 2, but we're fairly confident that with the reaching out that we've done and the candidates that we have on in line for these positions, we're going to be able to catch up and be on target for the leadership hiring. The evaluation, we're on track. And lastly, the technology platform, we thought it was going to cost 50, it cost us 100, and actually it's not going to be something that is going to be less in the future. We have to accept that we're going to need more money in technology. And we need to think through what the total cost will be. So based on this growth plan and its first year results, it really needs to go up to $1.3 million from $1.2 million. This is the financial story of the growth plan. And this is the financial story of the capital campaign as it relates to growth. Armed with this analysis, an individual raising dollars for an organization can go to a funder and say, here's where we are, and let me tell you why we need to increase the amount of the investment in future years. Funders who choose to invest in capital are partners with their grantees. They think of how can they be supportive? What are the right questions to ask that are strategically inclined so that we're working towards a common goal? This is not a compliance framework, it's a partnership framework. And for the organization who's carrying out that plan, it's really important that this one-pager, which looks fairly simple but has a lot of thought behind it, would really make the difference in that communication. And in capital campaigns, it's usually multi-year, it's for the long term. That story often evolves. And if year 1 we're off, that doesn't mean we did something wrong. That doesn't mean we made a mistake. The funder will not be happy. It means here's what we learned and here's how we're going to adjust for that in the future. So I encourage you, if you have a capital campaign in the works or you're thinking about one, you're building one, you are in the middle of one, come back to this slide and ask yourself, what would it take for us to be able to have this financial story around our plan? And how can we integrate our board management over it, as well as communication with funders. So just in conclusion, we've gone through the different sources of capital, the different purposes, the different ways to report on it. And I hope that this webinar has given you an enhanced perspective on how capital can change the way organizations grow. Raising dollars is not just for fundraising for the operations for the year. It's for the long-term sustainability, for resilience, for ability to grow and experiment and take risks. It's a longer-term framework. And as I mentioned earlier, and I want to leave you with this thought, and I'm going to turn to Ruth for questions, it's very difficult to seek this type of capital without a long-term view towards the strategy that you want to implement. If we can't tell our multi-year financial story, it makes it very difficult to raise capital. On the flip side, if you have a well-articulated strategy with a well-documented financial plan, you'll be in a much more successful position going out and raising the capital that you need in order to grow and flourish. Back to you, Ruth. I don't know if you've had any questions coming in, but I'm all ears.
Absolutely. And if you still have questions, make sure you just log them in, and I'll take them. In terms of, I'm really going to try to take them in order of how many people they might apply to. So the first question is something that I think we've heard in just about every financial webinar we've done, which is, what is that benchmark for an accumulated surplus or for reserves that people are supposed to have in hand? Can you talk a little bit, because that benchmark has shifted a lot over the years, and different people have different opinions.
Wonderful. So I think the right answer here is it depends. Of course, that's not the answer we want to hear, because we need to know a number. And so it depends on the business model. It depends on how urgently an organization may need to respond. A relief organization needs to have a higher availability of reserves because it may need to react very quickly in large sums of money. Putting aside exceptions like that, relief organizations or organizations that need immediate cash in large sums, regularly operating organizations, the rule of thumb that bankers and others who think about this is 3 to 6 months. Now, 3 to 6 months of what? 3 to 6 months of total operating expenses is the most conservative estimate. What that would mean is that the world were to stop in some significant way, revenue stop coming in, the perfect storm happens, we have 3 to 6 months of operations in our reserves to be utilized. The issue with that is that sometimes organizations have restricted revenues, and they say, if I didn't have those grants, I wouldn't incur those expenses. So they might modify that base upon to do 3 to 6 months to what maybe they call the core operating expenses. What would it take for my organization to be stable for a period of 3 to 6 months for my core operating costs? And then there's my definition that I share with folks when we are together in trainings, which is I often think of it as, what would it take for the executive director to sleep at night? Yeah. And everyone has a different risk tolerance. I've had EDs tell me it takes a year for me to sleep at night, and others say 3 months is all I need. I can make it with 3 months. So every organization has to make that number their own. It's the number that's going to shift someone from crisis to long-term strategy and then grow from there. So that would be my minimum number.
I love that last piece of the definition.
Yes, and for some it's payroll, 1 month or 2 months of payroll, 2 months of rent, and then I'm good. It depends.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a question that got asked in a few different ways by various people. How in heck do you position an organization to ask for change capital? Under what conditions do you think that it's given? I know that's a little bit of a multi-part question, but
So I think the positioning is about focus and clarity. And so an organization raises money to run programs to deliver its mission. And that's why funders, individuals, foundations support that. And they support that year's operations. And if that's all that we can position, the operations for the year, number of children served, that's what we can raise money for. If we're positioning ourselves for change capital, risk capital, we need to have a vision of that. And so I think a first step towards a capital campaign is a plan, be it strategic or be it growth plan. There needs to be a plan where an organization allows itself to dream beyond the restrictions of available resources today. If I could develop our curriculum in this way to get outcomes of these types, what would that take? And how would I know that I've succeeded when I get there? And so clarity around what the outcomes are, that's what investors are going to invest in, those outcomes. And to get there, what will it take? Where do I need to develop my infrastructure? What do I need to do in the form of experimentation? I think it's a process that is very different from our regular operating budget planning that's somewhat restrictive. This is giving the organization the permission to think beyond the current and then articulate that in a well-positioned plan, and ask, so to speak. As far as the ask part, it is based on that plan, and it's based on typically a growth campaign is going to be funded by those funders who have already invested in you and have seen the outcomes and believe in them. It's somewhat more unusual for funders to invest in growth capital for organizations they've never funded before. Having said that, there is a growing level of philanthropy that focuses on identifying a good idea and then helping an organization scale that. So that's why the clarity in that one of the first slides I had, where are we trying to grow? Are we trying to have some development, research and development and experimentation? Is this a rebalancing of who we are? What exactly is the goal that we want to accomplish at the end of these 3 years? With that clarity, I think the organization will be best positioned to go after those grants. That's assuming that this question is about the capital campaigns in that context, not working capital or any of the others.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is, while it may seem to some people like the idea of being able to get change capital is a long shot. Really, where it turns, whether or not you get change capital, the first thing that it turns on is your own clarity about what you want to change and how much it's going to cost and what the outcome is going to be. And that's something that's useful to do whether or not you have a good relationship with a foundation, because it very well could create a good relationship with a foundation if you had that level of clarity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So another question that we have heard a lot is one person asked, how do you convince foundations to replenish capital when you've had a number of bad years, and that some of those bad years could perhaps be put at the feet of not such completely great management, or what people perceive as not such completely great management?
I think the answer is very similar to the one we just covered, which is clarity, cost, and outcome. And so the clarity in this case may require a bit of humbleness to say, we are in an accumulated deficit of $75,000. We got there because it shows an understanding, because if you understand how you got to that deficit, you're more likely not to repeat it in the future. So understanding what caused the deficit would be the beginning of clarity. The second point to the clarity would be, what are you doing differently that is going to ensure that that is not a repeatable offense in the future? If it is about management, and that's already evident to the funder and to the leadership, then how is management changing? How is the board engaging to ensure that those activities that caused the deficit have been turned around? That's only part way. Now the question is, how is this organization going to be sufficiently strong and sufficiently strategic to turn the corner with those past challenges and go forward in a positive way? And that goes back to, what's your plan? There is a reason the organization exists. It may have had positive years and then had a few negative years. Well, let's come back to the positive. What is it about its approach to its work that allows it to achieve those outcomes? And then once you've gone beyond that, explaining the past and indicating how the future is in a different direction, then it's a growth plan like any other growth plan. We've worked with funders who have said, tell me the number. What is the number that is going to allow this organization to rebalance, meaning replenish those deficits, and go forward in a strategic way? I don't want to fund the number that will just make them whole. I want the number to make them whole and position them for success in the future. And that organization needs to know what that number is, not only the accumulated, which is, after a bit of analysis, comes right from the financials, but what will the long term be? And the one last point I'll say, when we're recovering from something that didn't go as well as we hoped, there more than ever, you need clarity of partnership between the staff and the board for ultimate outcomes. So how is the board a part of that, not only on paper, but how is the board a part of those asks and part of the commitment that that potential funder could see?
Yeah. I wanna just, emphasize that what you said about what is that number. I've been asked that question on any number of occasions, and I'm still appalled at how unprepared I am to answer that question. It is a number that we should have in our heads all the time. What would rebalance this organization and provide it with sustainability? It may be that that foundation won't be able to come up with the whole nut, but at least it gives them a sense of how much will do what in that situation.
Absolutely.
Just one additional question here, and then we're going to get going. But one person asked, given the alarming rate of financial weakness in the sector, what are the barriers to building strong balance sheet health?
Okay. I think,
small question.
Yes, tiny. One of the barriers, I think, is not understanding the business model and the revenue and expense drivers that get an organization to its final results for the year. So if we understand that we're delivering services within our means, and we're delivering, we're accepting grants that cover their costs, and if they're not, we're raising the difference, we have to have an eye on the model, because the balance sheet is not an accident. It's an outcome of what has transpired over the life of the organization. And so stabilizing the business model so that the organization generates sufficient revenue to cover its cost plus, that would be the most critical step to having a strong balance sheet. And I'll end this question by saying, if your budget that you present to your board for approval has revenues and expenses absolutely equal, which I see very often, then the message is we have every intention of spending every dollar we raise, and we are taking no steps towards strengthening our balance sheet. So a first step towards strengthening your balance sheet is making sure that you're in your budget and setting the parameters for the year budgeting for a surplus, which is meant to increase the strength of your reserves.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hilda. Every time I learn a whole bunch when I listen to you, and I hope people on this call have done the same. I do want to assure people that we will be sending you a copy of this webinar, and there is a list of resources that you can stay on for a couple of minutes and just look on the screen. There you go. And that will give you a sense of where else you might be able to go to get some of the explanations that you've asked for in questions that we weren't able to answer today. I have seen a number of questions in the question area that give us a sense of what we might do in future webinars, and we always welcome those suggestions. So make sure that you communicate with us about that. Finally, I want to say NPQ, we try to make sure that everything we provide to you is provided for free so that even the smallest of organizations can access it. That is made possible by organizations and people who do access it and have a little bit more money providing us with a donation. So you might want to think about when we send you a final, your final list of resources, etc. Please think about paying us what you think this was worth to you, and what you think our presence in your lives as information providers is worth to you. Because we definitely need all of your donations to make our business model work. With that said, thank you again to MetLife for sponsoring this, and we hope to see you again soon on one of these sessions. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Hilda.